Hi, everyone. I just wanted to welcome Brad and welcome all of you. Brad Rosenstein did a presentation at the New York branch at the ESU headquarters, I guess last spring, just before the end of winter, early spring, right before the pandemic hit. And it was an amazing presentation that he did at the branch, which I believe was the presentation on art and style, which had recently been received at the Lincoln Center, which was one of their most frequented shows that he had done at Lincoln Center. And when we started the preparation for our centennial and we started to look at New York City and the Jazz Age and the time that Evelyn Wrench first started to build the ESU, what better subject than the subject of Noel Coward? And I think Brad is one of the best speakers, and I welcome him today here for this very informative and fun presentation. Thank you so much, Brad.
Thank you so much, Karen. It's a pleasure. It seems like another lifetime ago that I was there. It was just February that we were able to all gather. Yeah. And obviously things have changed, but it's a great honor for me to be part of your centennial celebration and to be part of this landmark event for the ESU, which is such a vital and important organization. So what I'll be talking about today, the title of this talk today is Design for Living. And it's very much inspired by an exhibition that I'm currently working on, which, as Karen was mentioning, was originally supposed to have happened in July, but because of the pandemic got postponed, but thankfully not canceled. And it's going to be opening on November 20th at the Guildhall Art Gallery in London, which I'm thrilled has been able to move forward with this despite all the incredible obstacles that we're all dealing with right now. But it's been interesting because, Coward during his lifetime was a source of such hope and inspiration and joy, especially to his fellow English subjects at a time when life was incredibly difficult, especially during the darkest days of World War II. And it's been interesting how much joy and hope he's been able to give to us in working on this exhibition at another challenging time in history. So he never stops being a source of inspiration and pleasure. And so it's been lovely to return to him at a time like this. And we're already seeing an incredible level of interest in this exhibition that opens next month. But why Noel Coward? Why talk about him today? Well, there are so many reasons. It's been almost 50 years since his death, and yet his work still seems to resonate enormously for so many people. He is someone who seems to just keep speaking to our times. And I think there are many reasons for this. First of all, because he's this, total figure of elegance and wit, which is always attractive and which never seems to date. And his plays give just a lot of great fun and enjoyment for people, as do his incredible number of songs, the almost 400 songs that he wrote over his lifetime. But more than that, they seem to still be true. There are so many things he talks about the nature of love, about the nature of humanity, about the nature of how human beings do and don't connect with each other, often to great comic effect. These things never date. These things never go out of style, and they always have something to say. And I particularly think, one of his most crucial themes and most individual themes is about the simultaneously impossibility and necessity of love in our lives, which again, is a theme that I think never goes out of style, and the complexity with which he explores it in his work, I think that is something that's always timely. But in working on many, previous Coward exhibitions, one of the things that really intrigued me as I was looking at all the visuals of his work and the documentation of it over time was what an incredible visual impact his work had. And I think this is something that we've lost a little bit. We tend to, always identify Coward with verbal wit, the incredible verbal wit of his songs and his plays. But I think something that's been lost in the process a bit has been how incredible his plays looked on stage. From the very beginning of his career, he was working with some of the finest designers, the finest artists and painters, the finest couturiers dressing his casts. And so for people of his time, the visual element of his shows was just as attractive as the verbal element of what's come down to us. A lot of people don't realize that Coward was also usually the director of his shows, as well as the writer and star. And he had an incredible visual sense for what would be going on stage. And so this became part of what people expected of him over time. His work also has an incredible range. Now if most people think about Noel Coward, they think about him in a very specific context of the kind of drawing room comedy, people smoking cigarettes and drinking cocktails and being witty. And that's an aspect of his work and a very important part of his work. But for people of his time, simultaneously with the plays that we know best, he was also doing musical reviews, which were incredibly varied evenings of song and dance that could often go in surprising directions. He was also doing serious dramatic plays like The Vortex. He was also doing uber romantic operettas like Bittersweet. He was doing incredible spectacles like Cavalcade. And because these shows were so successful, they were sometimes running simultaneously. At one point, he had 4 shows on at the same time in the West End in London. And so for people of his time, he would have been this incredible chameleon, creating these very, very different shows over time. Now we have a very more, limited view of who Coward is, but that wasn't at all the view of people at his time. He was viewed as this incredibly prolific and diverse playwright and creator. Then there was the image of him off stage, where he also was a figure of great elegance and charm and wit. And people often had a hard time separating the two, but this sense of style became incredibly pervasive. He was also one of the great celebrities of his time. His fame was international. And so every aspect of him, not just his work on stage or on screen, but every aspect of his life was covered in incredible detail through the media of the time. So what he wore wound up setting trends. The decoration of his homes got published in picture magazines. So many details about him were also part of setting the style of his time. And we'll talk about many other aspects of this, but this became a really important thing to talk about in this exhibition. And it's really been a very informative and even revelatory way to look at his work from this visual aspect. And I also wanted to talk about the art in his life. I mean, he had very close working and personal relationships with artists at the time. Art was very important to him as something to live with. So he had a quite respectable art collection in his homes. He was really loved the combination of the traditional and the contemporary in his homes. So would juxtapose in ways that now seem very contemporary to us, the old and the new in his home decor. He was also a very enthusiastic hobbyist painter. And mostly this was known more privately in his lifetime. He never sold paintings. He would just give them away to friends or use them to raise money for charitable causes. And they've now become supremely collectible and actually very hard to find and quite valuable. And yet that was a very important part of his life too, his painting life as well. So in all these ways, art and style became part of it and became part of his design for living. So where did all this come from? First of all, he was born in the final weeks of 1899, shortly before Christmas. That's where his name, Noel, for Noel, came from. And throughout his life, he was acutely aware of the fact that he had been born in the 19th century. To everybody of his time, of course, he seemed like the most cutting edge, contemporary, up to the minute person, kind of the embodiment of the 20th century for many people, particularly in the 20s and 30s decades of his career. But to Noel himself, he really thought of himself as having one foot in the past century and one in the present. And I think it's an essential part of understanding and appreciating his work to know that. There was a very traditional side of him. There was a very Victorian Edwardian side of him that really revered tradition and that carried, in some sense, even the moral sense of those times, discipline, hard work. And then there was a part of him that fully embraced his contemporary culture and became a defining element of it, you know, enjoyed every second of the Roaring Twenties to its hilt. So these things were constantly in collision, and I think some of his best work grows out of that realization. He had a mother who incredibly supported his theatrical ambitions. She had been a lifelong theater goer herself, Violet Coward. And the family, the other important thing to know about Coward is that the background he came from is incredibly different from that was represented on stage. He was a suburban boy from Teddington, and lived a life of what he referred to later as genteel poverty. His family was always in financial straits, finally only partially solved when his mother started taking in boarders and started a rooming house. But he really needed to start contributing to the family income. And so the world of dressing gowns and cocktails and, you know, elegant flats in Mayfair, this couldn't have been farther from the reality of what Coward grew up with. But there were many opportunities when he was a young man for children to be in theater, particularly around the holiday times with pantomimes and Christmas shows. There was an incredible call for child actors at the time. And he and his mother literally answered an ad for a piece that was going to premiere, and he got his first professional role in the West End at age 11 in a children's show called The Goldfish. He was Prince Muscle. And he went on from there, he had you know, a fairly successful career as a child actor. It was important income to help his family survive. But of course, from our point of view, he was also falling in love with the theater and the whole world around the theater as well, the elegance of the West End. Something that was also a feature of this, even before he started writing, was he started drawing and got very interested in art. He had a grandfather who had been a very prolific amateur painter, and started keeping, there's just one example from one of his early notebooks on the screen of some drawings he'd done, which show an incredible attention to costume and fashion and the roles that clothes play in what it reveals or conceals about people. He was already very astute about this, and this is from when he was very young, in his early teens. You start seeing the sensibility in his work. And that's a picture of him as a boy actor in one of his earliest roles from that first year he started on stage in 1911. But one of the crucial relationships for him, particularly in forming his own style as a dramatist, was working with the man at the piano, Charles Hawtrey, who was one of the leading actor managers of his day. And Hawtrey was really a revolution, especially in terms of his acting style. You know, this was coming out of, this was 1911's production called The Great Name. And they were coming out of a period in Victorian theater where everything was big and grand and grandiose, and, you know, everything was larger than life. And Hawtrey really pioneered this much more light, subtle comedic touch. Everything was understated, and yet, you know, could increase the laughter. The more understated he got, the more the audience was rolling in the aisles. And Coward absorbed this like a sponge. He saw that this was something new. It was something very different than anybody else was doing at the time. And Hawtrey was also a director of his shows, and Noel watched him like a hawk. And to the end of his career, he said, you know, whenever he got stuck as a director, he would always say to himself, what would the governor have done? What would Hawtrey have done in this situation? And he'd know how to handle it. But he was just so impressed with Hawtrey's professionalism and with this incredible underplayed comedic style, which he himself would adopt. It was very inspiring to him. And in short order, he got interested in writing plays, and he started submitting them to the managements and not always getting very far. He had a couple of minor successes, including the first of his plays to be in the West End, which was I'll Leave It to You, which opened in 1920. He was just 19 years old, and he already had his first play in the West End. And that is also the occasion for this exhibition, because we wanted to celebrate that important centenary of Noel Coward's. And in very short order, he started finding success. He was also he had always been very musical. His family was musical. And he had started writing songs at an early age and started submitting these as well to producers. And it was the heyday of the musical review. And so someone who was up and coming like this, and who could write comedy and who could write a catchy tune, was going to immediately find a hearing, and he quickly did. And his first show was London Calling in 1923, which really put him on the map. He wrote most of the sketches, he wrote most of the songs, he performed in the review, he did a lot of the direction of the review, and it really got him going. And his second review, On With the Dance, was done for the mega producer, England's Ziegfeld, Charles B. Cochrane. And it was the first time that he really saw his name in lights here on the London Pavilion. And it was a life-changing moment for him to get that kind of recognition. But his rise was incredibly rapid. In that first review, London Calling, he appeared with Gertrude Lawrence, which would eventually become one of the most legendary pairings in theatrical history. They had known each other since the time that they were child actors and had appeared together in several plays and been on tour together, so had become very close friends early on. Their first appearance was in a German play where they played angels, and they had stuffed themselves with peppermint candies right before the curtain went up. And Noel said the curtain went up on two little angels being violently ill on stage from having overindulged themselves. So it wasn't the most auspicious beginning to a career. But they stayed in contact, and she was already starting to get a foothold in the reviews. But this show, London Calling, really put her on the map. He wrote some stellar sketches for her, including a tour de force comic monologue called Early Morning. And then they appeared in several sketches together, and it was the first time they appeared together as adults. And it really launched that inspired stage partnership. She just had a way with his dialogue, with his songs. She knew instantly what he was after, and she could capture the comedy, she could capture the pathos, she could capture the romance. And he always said there was probably no better interpreter of his work during his lifetime. One of the other things he discovered at this point in the reviews, working with this first review was done for André Charlot, who was Cochrane's big rival. And it was a very important part of the reviews to design, the design element. The sets, the costumes were an incredible part of the attraction of doing it. And Edward Molyneux, I say that he pronounced the name Molyneux. He was Anglo-Irish, but I always hesitate, and so I still call him Molyneux. But Edward Molyneux was the leading British couturier at that time, had already established a major foothold in Paris, really the first British couturier to do that. And he was enlisted to do the costumes, which was setting an incredibly high bar for design. He and Coward became very good friends and remained collaborators throughout their life. In fact, he wound up dressing most of Coward's leading ladies all the way through his last plays in the 1960s. He was an incredibly important figure in design with Coward. But this was their first time working together, and it introduced several of Coward's earliest hit songs, including Parisian Pierrot, which is what Gertie is appearing in on the left. In this beautiful Molyneux costume. On the right is Noel looking very uncoward-like in a number called Russian Blues, but he was very fond of this outfit. He was obviously still finding his voice, but also it was the property of the reviews to be very diverse and to encompass many different worlds in what they were doing. So it was not at all unusual that he should appear in this kind of Russian fantasy as part of this very contemporary review. But the costumes and the sets were a huge part of this. This is Charles B. Cochrane, his longtime producer, and people said there was never anyone quite like him in being matched with Coward's work. He just seemed to have an understanding of what was required. He had an incredible theatrical savvy. He had done everything from promoting prize fights to serious dramatic plays, and he knew the theater world inside out. And he also had a great sense of the importance of design. And so was really an important teacher to Coward in this, and really pulled him into this world of having the best of the best when it came to sets and costumes, and how important that was in establishing an image in these shows. And the woman sitting on the table is Jessie Matthews, who was one of many stars that got launched in the Coward reviews. And this is from one of the second Coward review, which many people thought was one of the best reviews ever done, called This Year of Grace, that was done in 1928. And these are what was called Mr. Cochrane's Young Ladies. This was his counterpoint to, in New York, the Ziegfeld Girls. And it was an incredible, not only training ground for young women in getting into theater, but it also became a launching pad for a number of stars. The woman third from the right at the time was called Marjorie Robertson, but in a few years changed her name to Anna Neagle and became a great, great British star. And Jessie Matthews, of course, got launched to enduring fame and also a film career from her work in the reviews. You can see how sumptuous the costumes were and how important they were to the impact of these shows. But Coward was also in these shows writing sketches. He was writing comic songs. And this is the first staging in a review of Mad Dogs and Englishmen. The show had actually been introduced by Beatrice Lillie in a different review in New York in a very different way. But for this show, which is called Words and Music in 1932, Coward wrote a whole introductory sketch to it about a long lost British missionary who's found in the jungle. And then it leads into the song Mad Dogs and Englishmen, which is probably his best known comic song. But the important part about the reviews, I mean, they served for a songwriter, they served exactly the same function as a music video would now. It would give a very strong visual context, sometimes even a dramatic narrative to a song that helped to implant it in the public mind. And the songs were often also performed by leading stars of the time who are identified with it. And this would really launch the song out into the world. It was still the heyday of sheet music. You know, every parlor still had a piano, people sang, people played. So sheet music sales were a tremendously important part of this. Radio had come in 1920, so that became a way, and the gramophone record was getting refined. So it was this way to instantly start to disseminate these songs. But they all got launched with these stagings in the reviews, which were often very daring and ambitious for their time. This is the original staging for Mad About the Boy, which has become a standard, but which has gotten very divorced from its original setting, which was that all these women in the song were singing about a matinee idol movie star who they were in love with. And you saw each of them idolizing this man who, of course, in reality was very different from what they were imagining. But this was how the song was originally introduced. And it started in a bustling setting outside a cinema. And part of, you know, what Coward was about, particularly in this early part of his career, was just his love affair with the city of London itself. He loved its energy, he loved its magic, he loved its diversity, and especially the energy around the West End. And so this is the actual finale of This Year of Grace, where the cast broke the fourth wall and was just singing about the traffic jam that they would all be going out into when the show ended, which it was just about to do. It was kind of this meta-theatrical moment. And then they showed them all in their cars and their taxis and their motorcycles, making their way through a Piccadilly traffic jam. But you can see, first of all, you know, how elaborate the stagings of these shows were. But also how much was being conveyed about Coward's sense of the city of London itself and his excitement with it. One of the most groundbreaking stages that he did was for the song Dance Little Lady. And, you know, even though Coward was very much identified with the 1920s, he also had a very critical sense about it. He could see its dark side. He had had friends who really got pretty damaged during that era between alcohol and drug use. And it was not all, you know, cocktails and laughter, as he writes about. And this song, Dance Little Lady, was a real reflection of that. And again, is this, you know, collision between his 19th century self and his 20th century self, about someone who's spinning out of control in this world. And it's very much linked to the syncopated rhythms of jazz. And it's incredibly musically complex song. And for its staging, he got very excited. He had seen a exhibition of Oliver Messel's work, who had started out as a painter and then started exhibiting papier-mâché masks, which were very much in vogue in the 20s. And Coward got really intrigued with the look of these masks, and he thought it would be perfect for the staging of Dance Little Lady. And so he got Messel involved with it and created that number that we just saw the picture of. it was quite a groundbreaking moment. He was pulling on many, many different elements of theater to create this, and this was looked back to by many people as one of the highlights of his review life. And it also shows that the world of the reviews could be very macabre and very dark and surreal sometimes. It wasn't just about toe tapping tunes and, you know, beautiful girls in beautiful gowns. It could go into some very dark places. This, by the way, is the original Messel mask that Coward had seen. So you could see he was not afraid of going into some pretty spooky places in his work. You know, his love affair with London continued throughout his career. You know, he wrote what became really its unofficial anthem, London Pride, during World War II, during the darkest days of the Blitz. He wrote music for a ballet in the 1950s called London Morning that took place entirely outside Buckingham Palace. The city was a constant source of energy and inspiration to him. And maybe in no play more so than in this incredible epic spectacle that he did called Cavalcade in 1931, which was the original upstairs downstairs story. It told two parallel stories of a very upper class family and a working class family who went through the years together, covered 30 years of British history, which coincidentally was exactly the time frame of Coward's lifetime at that point. Went everywhere from New Year's Eve on 1899, which was right after he had been born, right up until the then present day of 1931, jumping through history. It was an unbelievable epic. It was done at the Drury Lane Theater. It had 22 set changes, used technology that was absolutely state of the art to achieve that at the time, had a cast and crew of 400 people. The kind of thing, of course, that you could never mount again today, which is why Cavalcade has very rarely been done. But it really established an incredible image in people's mind. And again, this is about as far as you can get from most people's conventional idea of Coward. And yet this was entirely his brainchild as playwright, as director, as producer. This was so successful that it caught the attention of 20th Century Fox Film Studios, who actually dispatched a camera crew and who filmed the entire stage production and used it as a blueprint for the film that they would make, which became the highest grossing film of its year in 1933 and won the Academy Award for Best Picture, among others. So Coward was hand in glove with the development of technology, the development of the talkies. His dialogue, his songs were naturals for this, the new talking medium of film. So he became incredibly, popular, and all of these things increased his fame, having his properties almost immediately sold to the movies. Unfortunately, most of the films, Cavalcade is a wonderful film. Most of the film adaptations were not nearly up to the level of the stage originals, but they still increased Coward's fame enormously and were an important part of his work. And this influence of the City of London goes right up until what became his very last original musical for Broadway, The Girl Who Came to Supper in 1963, which is set exactly in the time period when he started out on stage in London. It's set right at the coronation of George V, and becomes a wonderful nostalgic look for him at the London of his time. Beautiful sets by Oliver Smith, one of the great Broadway set designers, and costumes by Irene Sheriff, who was a 5-time Academy Award winner and did really beautiful work on the show. And really was for Coward a labor of love and kind of going back to his childhood vision of London and the world that he remembered very vividly still. Well, I've started mentioning designers, and it's an opportunity to segue into their world, because these became the most important collaborators with Coward, and probably none more important than this woman, Gladys Calthrop, who had started out as an artist. She hadn't designed for the theater previously, but she and Coward became a very, very, very close friends. And she really became a central part of his adopted family, intimate circle of friends. But she also became his designer of choice, and she rose to the challenge absolutely brilliantly. And really, for most of her career, she did occasional outside assignments, but for most of her career, she was Coward's designer for 25 years or more. And she did comedies, she did dramas, she did revues, she did operettas, she did film. Incredibly, incredibly prolific and talented woman. And this will just show a little bit of the range. She started designing the Vortex, which is on the left, which was Coward's major theatrical breakthrough. It was, again, something we don't typically associate with him, but was a very intense psychological drama of the time. And it introduced the vision of him as the dressing gown Coward, the ultra sophisticated Coward. And she could pivot from that 1920s contemporary milieu and could just as easily design ball gowns for things like Bittersweet, which is shown here. She just had such a great sense of clothes. She had such a great sense of setting. And she was also quintessentially English. And I think it's a very important part of what Coward did. I think it's no accident that he gravitated to British designers for much of his career. I think there was so much about the sensibility that was important to his work, whether it was comedy, whether it was drama, whether it was musical. There was an incredible sense of style, but that was also coupled with the sense of restraint and understatement, which is Coward always appreciated. There was a sense of the architectural quality of clothes, combining really luxurious fabrics with a very strong sense of tailoring and shape. All these kind of quintessentially British elements of fashion, I think, were very important to him in the world that he was creating on stage. So I'm going to give you a little taste of Bittersweet. This is footage that was discovered recently that was shot of the original stage production. I'll give you just a little flavor of what his work looked like on stage.
Fight stagnation. Haughty boys, naughty boys, all we do is to pursue sensation. The portals of society are always open wide.
The world our eccentricity condones.
A note of quaint variety we're certain to provide.
We dress in very decorative tones. Faded boys, jaded boys, womankind's gifts to a bulldog nation. In order to distinguish us from less enlightened minds, we all wear a green carnation. And as we are the reason for the 90s being gay, we all wear a green carnation.
So just to give you a little sense, that was some British Pathé footage from 1929 of the original production of Bittersweet. And I think it gives you a wonderful sense of Coward, the stage director, and also a real sense of Gladys's sets and costumes. And you can see how vital they were to how those shows came across. Jumping ahead to another, side of Gladys's talent, this is the play designed for living, and was groundbreaking in so many ways. You got a little taste in the Green Carnation number. Coward was a gay man at a time when homosexuality was a criminal offense in Britain. And so there was very good reason, to stay closeted, as well as, having an image of yourself on stage. And yet he was incredibly frank about sexuality and incredibly open about it. And this play was very, very daring for its time and really kind of proposing at its core the relationship of these three people, two men and a woman, who are clearly in a menage a trois relationship with each other. Very daring stuff for 1933. But the most daring thing is that's not even what the play is about. The relationship between the characters is a given in the show, and their love for each other. It's really much more about sorry, my phone's going off. It's really much more about what is the relationship between these people and how is it affected, especially by success. Sorry, did it boot me out of I hope you're seeing my screen again now. It's really about the relationship of these people and what effect that their growing success has on them at the time. And it's so much of it was about the design of what Gladys's sets were doing. You saw the evolution of these people going from a very poor Parisian garret at the beginning of the play to a New York penthouse at the end, which became a very important part of the evolution of these characters linked to the design. Oh, I think I've gotten, there we go. So it was also about the relationship of him with the Luntz. They had become friends when none of them were famous early on. And they really developed a real rapport. They became stars, each became stars in their own right. And he vowed he would write them a play when they all had become famous. And this became it, Designed for Living. Another play that really was based very closely on Coward's own existence was Present Laughter, which he admitted was very autobiographical, basically about a very kind of egomaniacal actor and the world around him, that pivots on his fame and success. Probably one of Coward's greatest comedies. And one of the most interesting things about it was that Gladys, because she knew Coward's world so well, she had in fact helped to decorate many of his homes and apartments over the years as a close friend. And so she actually put his home on stage in this play, just as Coward was putting his life on stage. And so many, many elements of what she used in the 1943 original and the 1947 revival found their way onto the stage as reflections of Coward's own homes, also with a sense of humor, also with the sense of a little bit of satire of his taste being put on stage in the more Baroque elements of this. And she also got involved with his films as his film career began to expand. He had a unique opportunity to start making films in the 1940s that he had total control over. So he started a unit working with a very young David Lean, who had been Britain's best film editor, but had never been a director before, became his co-director on In Which We Serve, this big war epic that Coward wrote, produced, directed, and even wrote the musical score for, but co-directed with Lean. And then they began a partnership adapting several of his plays. Gladys, was very easily shifted gears into that gritty wartime world that was very different from what she had been designing for Coward on stage. And this, of course, was probably the most famous of Coward's films with Lean, Brief Encounter. It's certainly the best screenplay that Coward ever wrote. It became a classic of British cinema and, a real testimony to wartime romance and was really something that people were craving at the end of World War II, was to refine this, but with two very ordinary people. This was not the cocktail and dressing gown set that Coward had written about, just two ordinary people, both married, who fall in love with each other, and how they navigate that and their sense of obligations to the people in their lives. Really, really brilliant classic film to this day. One of the other things that Coward, that has really come out of looking at Coward through this extremely visual lens, is how much he promoted the work of women. Certainly Gladys Calthrop was an example of that, certainly in the roles he wrote for women on stage, which were incredibly strong and varied and independent, gave them opportunities. But on the creative side, men tended to still dominate in that side of the theater. And Coward really was very important to him because he had so many strong creative women in his life to promote women at a time when that was not the norm. So certainly with Gladys, which, you know, she really became his designer of choice for 25 years. But it happened throughout his career. And Dora Zinkeisen was another favorite of his. He started working with her in the reviews, where she did brilliant work in designing costumes and could do anything from madcap comedy to you know, really rich romance in her work. This is one of her designs for Anna Neagle, who had graduated from the Cochrane Chorus Line to become a big movie star, and she starred in the film version of Bittersweet that Zinkeisen designed. This beautiful self-portrait of Zinkeisen is from the National Portrait Gallery, and I'm thrilled to say that it will be in the exhibition. Provides a really unique insight into the strength, the vulnerability, the vision of these women who worked with Coward, who were such an important part of his work. And then couturiers like Edward Molyneux, you know, who worked with him, who would stay with him throughout his career, often designing for his leading ladies. Perhaps no more famously than this white satin dress for Gertrude Lawrence in Private Lives. It had been part of Coward's original conception of the play. His first image was of Gertie in a white Wallonie frock standing on a terrace in the south of France, and that became the first act of Private Lives. This dress became legendary, as it was for much of Molyneux's work. He was a genius at draping, and the combination of very luxurious fabrics with an incredible sense of simplicity, but architectural quality to the dress. This picture got published in Vogue, became famous around the world, and became one of the most iconic costumes in British theater history. And I'm very proud to say we've just done a meticulous reconstruction of this dress, and that will be on view in the exhibition as well. Norman Hartnell, who later became dressmaker to the Queen and the Queen Mother, had always wanted to work with Coward. In fact, had done a few costumes for some of his early reviews with Cochrane, but most famously designed all of Gertrude Lawrence's 20 costumes for Tonight at 8:30, which was a cycle of 9 one-act plays that Coward wrote, and they appeared in London and New York to great acclaim. And her costumes are absolutely amazing. Through these. In fact, some of these plays seem like a fashion show, but it was a very important part of what he was doing, and Coward appreciated the publicity, and he had also appreciated the beauty of the work as it was being, as it was contributing to the world he was creating on stage. Cecil Beaton became another very important designer in his work. He had had a tremendous jealousy of Coward earlier in their career. He himself was an aspiring playwright, an aspiring actor, a side that didn't really work out for him. But of course, he became world renowned as a photographer and then as a designer. And they finally buried the hatchet and actually became good friends and collaborators, and worked together on 2 shows, one of which is the last show he did with the Lentz called Quadrille. Did these beautiful designs for London and New York. He and Coward came from that same Victorian Edwardian world, and it was their favorite period to represent on stage. So it was a natural pairing. And then in a very different mode, this show, Look After Lulu, which was Coward had adapted from a Feydeau farce. And Beaton went in a completely different direction with this kind of Art Nouveau world gone mad, almost psychedelic in its use of color, but brilliant use of design, and very much in keeping with the farcical world that was part of that play. And you know what Beaton could also do, because he was also a major fashion photographer, was then these designs could get known all over the world. And so the dress that Polly Rolls is wearing on the left in this was adopted by a model And Beaton, then wearing his fashion photographer hat, shot it with a model for Vogue, who was doing a kind of Loie Fuller butterfly imitation with the gown. This work became known, far beyond what anybody saw in the show, but it had an enormous influence, in the fashion world at large, getting published in Vogue. He also worked later in his career, Coward, with, depending on whether he was in Paris, he was Mambochet in America, he was Mainbacher, but wonderful, wonderful designer, major American, probably the first major American couturier, established himself in Paris, and then when World War II broke out, moved to New York, and designed several Coward shows. He did the Broadway production of Blithe Spirit, its Broadway premiere, and did this wonderful design for Leonora Corbett that was featured also in Vogue. That's where this color photograph comes from. And he also did all the designs for Mary Martin's dresses for this television show that she did with Coward, Tonight Together with Music, which was his debut on television, which was a huge, huge success. It was also the first big program on CBS to be broadcast in color at the time. And so people were actually able to appreciate the beauty of these Mainbacher gowns in living color, as they said, when the show was first broadcast. But, Coward was always very savvy about his image from the beginning. He had managed it carefully, and he, knew that this vision of what he was on stage could be portrayed very well off. And so he managed this throughout his career. So many of what was known, as his onstage persona became his offstage persona. The dressing gowns, the smoking accoutrements, the luxurious opening night gifts, that all became part of his culture as well. He cultivated this look of, the playboy who never took himself too seriously and became, in his own right, a kind of matinee idol, both in early films like The Scoundrel and certainly on stage. And he also, was really modeling a very different vision of masculinity. And even though he was closeted about his sexuality, many people got it. Many people knew what he was, what his real identity was. And, there was no such term at the time, but I think he really became a kind of, a pioneer metrosexual. I think there was that vision of, there was a different view of what a man could be. And simultaneously in his travels, when he was outside of Britain, he could really be himself. That gave him an opportunity to, to be in his identity much more comfortably. And that was a side of his life too. And he traveled extensively during his lifetime, and it gave him time away from the spotlight. It gave him time to write, but it also gave him time to be who he was. Another side of him that very few people know about today was that he was the president of the Actors Orphanage for over 20 years in Britain, and did amazing things for these children whose welfare he cared about deeply. He got them out of Britain during the Blitz and got them moved into much better circumstances, and spent the better part of over 20 years devoted to this charity. It also became a part of his style. He started doing these big theatrical garden parties with major stage and screen stars, with royalty, here like the Duke and Duchess of Kent involved, that raised thousands of pounds for the charity. And then later moved indoors to be very successful on stage in places like the London Palladium. And you see the style, this offstage style, his royal style that was part of these events. And we found this original gray top hat that he had worn since the 1930s, which was beautifully refurbished by the company who made it, Lock & Company. This will be on display in the exhibition. And he was able to pivot his look going into the 1950s and really adapt it to become part of this new kind of hipster culture. And so this was this Vegas dressing gown he wore, which was a huge success, is going to play Las Vegas as a cabaret entertainer, and really brought him great fame, a real resurgence in his career from that point on. And this wonderful 1950s dressing gown we just had restored, and this will be on display. And his boom suit all the way to his, later film career in the 1950s, where he specialized in stealing movies away, playing these, supporting roles, character roles, but doing them brilliantly. And this was in the movie Boom. The famous Savile Row tailor Douglas Hayward made this wonderful chocolate brown suit for him, which we have, including all the accessories that are original and that he wore in Boom with Elizabeth Taylor. And his homes were part of that style too. As I was saying, he loved the combination of the traditional and the contemporary. He enlisted wonderful interior designers like Siri Mom to, assist him in refining this look. This was his home in the country, Goldenhurst. And I think we're running short on time, so I'm going to skip over. There was a little home movie clip I was going to include, but I think we're a little tight on time. But this was, his life in the country. And again, he kind of combined these elements. He loved the traditional elements of the home, but it also was a very contemporary place as well. But never precious, never too fancy. It was always a place where people could come and relax and have fun. And then he, in the 40s, started visiting Jamaica and very quickly acquired 2 properties there that he built homes on. And it became an extension also of his painting life, which had been a hobby of his since the 1930s. His response to the colors and the textures of life on his travels, but particularly in Jamaica, was a huge inspiration to his paintings. He was able to combine all these elements throughout his different homes, and many of these signature pieces, like the chair he's sitting in, which was referred to as the Hamlet chair, those wings of time that were over the hearth at Goldenhurst, traveled with him to subsequent homes and ended up as his home in Switzerland in Les Avants. There was a remarkable consistency to Coward's taste and his lifestyle that carried through over time, and yet he was continually able to reinvent himself for the times. The last section of the exhibition is called Marvelous Party, and it's really about how Coward's influence has remained constant and still is having a very powerful impact to this day. So we show it in a number of different ways. There are fashion designers like Georgina von Etzdorf, who's made a huge part of her career reimagining these kinds of dressing gowns and smoking jackets of Coward's day in very luxurious form. There are hotel suites around the world named for Coward, some of them actually places he stayed in, some of them meant to honor him. This is at the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Bangkok, the Noel Coward Suite, but he leaves his mark there in many places, including the Savoy and the Dorchester Hotel in London. We found that fragrance was a very important part of who he was. He loved to give a perfume. It was his favorite gifts to his leading ladies and the other important women in his life, and was a great fan of scent himself. He was a great patron of Floris, the boutique in London. And this became an important part, and it's mentioned frequently in his work. And to this day, his paintings are prized and collected, and that's the cover of a book that just came out in August that uses one of his Portofino paintings as the cover art quite beautifully. This is the American designer Anna Sui did a whole collection in the fall of 2017 that was inspired by the movie version of Blithe Spirit. And she adapted the kind of Technicolor sheen and also the ghostly elements of the film became a very important part of her work in that collection. And we'll have 2 of her beautiful looks on display in the exhibition as well. And you can just see this resonance going on to this day. You know, we saw that picture of Leonora Corbett that was featured in Vogue in this Mainbacher costume from Blithe Spirit. And you can see it today. This is from this year's Oscars with Janelle Monáe, and something that is very reminiscent of that same look. And you can see this continuity going on. And in the course of this exhibition's run, there's a brand new major movie version of Blithe Spirit that's just about to be released. With Judi Dench and Dan Stevens and Leslie Mann and Isla Fisher, showing again that this work doesn't date. It continues on and on to the present day, and it still has an impact. People love being part of Coward's world, and they love reimagining it for our own times. So that will wrap up my presentation, but I'll be very happy to take questions at this point. So I'm here for you.
All right, if you have any questions. Yes, if you have any questions, feel free to enter them into the chat or the Q&A section at the bottom of your screens.
I must have told you everything. Well, it's one thing I do hope is, hopefully when all the travel restrictions related to this pandemic can finally come to an end, we're very hopeful that people will still be able to make their way to London. The show will be
Doesn't
running.
seem like any questions right now. I might invite, actually, seems perhaps you were very thorough. Let me invite Karen Karpovich back in. Oh no, there are some questions. How long does the exhibit run from Loveday Conquest?
It will open on the 20th of November, and it's got a 6-month run until 16th of May. So, I was just saying, I mean, obviously there's so much uncertainty related to the pandemic, but I think we all have hopes that things will start to turn a corner in the new year. There has been incredible interest in the exhibition already in London because they have to do, time ticketing for people to see the show safely, but incredible interest in people signing up already from the opening day on. But very much hoping we'll get to a point that we can all go to London and give people a chance to enjoy the exhibition before it closes in May.
Well, okay, so all the questions are pouring in now. So Don Patillo out of Atlanta asks, did he always use the umlaut in his surname?
Yes, the diaresis. Yeah, over that was always a part of his name. As I said, he was born a few weeks before Christmas, so his mother named him Noel in honor of Noel. So yes, that was always a part of it. And from the very beginning, it's really interesting. Even as a teenager, when he writes his name, it becomes a part of his style. It becomes almost his brand. Those two little dots became very important to him. He was very, very savvy about every little thing that would make him distinctive. And those two dots continue throughout his career. But yes, that was a part of his name from birth.
All right, next question from Paul Bogosian of the Boston branch is, what was Coward's relationship to Hollywood figures of the time?
Incredibly warm and intimate. First of all, there was a huge British colony in Hollywood that were often British stage people who Coward knew from boyhood on. So he felt completely at home in Hollywood. And many of these folks were, old friends of his. Many of them had appeared in plays of his before they went to Broadway. So he knew everybody from Ronald Colman to Cary Grant, and then, became very good friends with people. Marlene Dietrich just called him up after she saw him in his first movie, The Scoundrel, to tell him how fabulous it was. And he thought it was a prank and hung up on her. But she called back and they became very, very dear friends. She became his kind of unofficial chauffeur when she went to Hollywood. And he was there a lot. He was not a fan of Los Angeles, but he was there a lot because his plays were constantly being adapted for movies. So he had business reasons to be there. But he also had many, many great friends in Hollywood and was wined and dined every time he was there. He felt very much at home there.
The next question from James Kerr out of Dallas is, did Coward actually enjoy life as much as presented to the public?
I think he absolutely did. When you read his diaries, when you read his letters, which are even more unguarded with friends, I mean, he had his trials and tribulations like everybody else. He had his dark moments, he had his fears, he had his doubts. He was a human being. But yes, he enjoyed his life to the hilt. He loved being a star. He loved everything that made possible. He loved everything to do with the theater, including all of its offstage rituals as much as its onstage rituals, and loved connecting to that world. And his wealth also gave him the freedom to have these private retreats in places like Switzerland and Jamaica, where he could get away from all that and just be himself. But many of his friends would come, and stay with him during those times. It was a constant revolving door of his friends. And he was someone with a profound gift for friendship. I think that's something that often gets left out in his life. Had really deep, meaningful friendships with the people in his life. And they were lifelong, most of these people some of them from boyhood on. And he was there for them. He was really there for his friends. And that's something that a lot of people might not think about him. It wasn't all about him. He was very focused on his friends' well-being and came to their rescue time and again. He was a really terrific friend over time. But yes, I think he had a ball. He really enjoyed himself.
So not so much a question, but a statement from Clark Goodwin, who says, thank you very much for your presentation. A great collection of visuals and history.
Thank you.
Additionally, Shauna Grissett says, so enjoyed, many thanks. Bill Mashmeyer from Cleveland says, you haven't mentioned his poetry, sorry, which I find quite enjoyable.
It's tremendously enjoyable, and there's a whole beautiful book of his collected verse, which was, published piecemeal in his lifetime, but then has recently been collected, edited by Barry Day, who's the wonderful scholar of Coward. His poems are incredible, and they provide a whole different light on what he does. It's been less of a focus in this exhibition because we've been so focused on the visual side of him. But his poems are an incredible window into the private man. And you really give a reflection of what a deep feeling person he was, that it goes much beyond the cocktails and laughter image, that he was someone who thought very deeply about everything from politics to the nature of friendship and love, to death and what that meant, especially as he got older and started encountering more health problems. His poems I would highly recommend to everybody. They become almost a kind of autobiography of him in themselves, and are also just very enjoyable reading as well.
All right, I think that concludes all the questions that we have. I've invited Karen Karpovich on screen. I'm going to ask her to unmute, and I'll let her take it from here.
Anyway, Brad, thank you again.
My pleasure.
For being one of our dear speakers, and we'll be in touch. And we just hope to hear more from you about Noel Coward, and hopefully we can get you into some person events when the pandemic.
The impossible dream, I know, it seems like another world.
Dream, but keep us abreast on what's going on, and we'll keep our community up, updated on what's happening, because you obviously are doing some incredible work.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure to be part of this, and congratulations on the Centennial. It's a wonderful milestone.
Thank you very much. And Noel Coward was a good way to start it, because I'm sure he really dealt with a lot of adversity and was able to always move above it, which is a great thing to do, to understand these days. So Anyway, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.